The $70 million Gulfstream G650ER thundered to a stop outside Teterborough's VIP terminal, its engines still whining as Captain Rodriguez stepped into the downpour. Inside, his boss, billionaire tech mogul Sawyer Harrison, was being escorted toward the exit by airport security, handcuffs glinting in the amber light. "This man is trespassing," gate manager Brenda Higgins declared triumphantly to the growing crowd of onlookers, their champagne glasses frozen mid-sip. What Brenda didn't know was that the imposing aircraft behind her bore Harrison's name on its registration. What she couldn't see was the security footage now uploading to social media, and what she would never anticipate was how spectacularly her prejudice was about to destroy not just her career, but her entire worldview in the next 60 seconds. He simply nodded and stepped aside, right as a $70 million Gulfstream G650ER taxied directly up to the window, its captain stepping into the downpour with a singular mission, escorting his boss to his private jet. Teterboro Airport in New Jersey is the beating heart of private aviation for the East Coast elite. It is a place where wealth is whispered, not shouted, where the tarmac is crowded with the most expensive flying machines engineered by human hands, and where the terminals are designed to look more like five-star hotel lobbies than transit hubs. Sawyer Harrison pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the signature flight support terminal, wiping a bead of cold November rain from his forehead. At 38, Sawyer was the founder and CEO of Harrison Dynamics, a supply chain analytics firm that had recently gone public to the tune of $8 billion. He was a man who moved markets with a single phone call. But looking at him on this dreary Tuesday evening, you wouldn't know it. He had spent the last 3 days locked in a windowless boardroom in Manhattan, fighting off a hostile takeover bid. He had slept a total of 6 hours. His tailored bronze suits were packed away in his duffel. Right now, he was wearing a faded gray Yale track jacket, well-worn raw denim jeans, and a pair of comfortable scuffed New Balance sneakers. He carried a battered leather messenger bag over his shoulder. He was a black man operating at the highest echelons of corporate America, entirely accustomed to being the smartest and wealthiest person in the room, but also deeply familiar with the snap judgments his mere presence could provoke. The terminal was a sanctuary of warm amber lighting, polished marble floors, and the subtle scent of expensive espresso and leather. Sawyer took a deep breath, relishing the quiet, and walked toward the primary reception desk. Behind the monolithic curve of the mahogany desk stood Brenda Higgins. Brenda had been the front desk manager at this specific FBO, fixed base operator, for 4 years. She was a woman in her late 40s whose uniform was immaculately pressed, her blonde hair sprayed into an unyielding helmet. She prided herself on being the gatekeeper to the 1%. She knew the regulars, the hedge fund managers, the real estate tycoons, the aging rock stars, and she treated them with a cloying, practiced reverence. Currently, Brenda was fawning over a man leaning against the counter. Charles Montgomery was a mid-level executive at a regional bank, a man whose tailored pinstripe suit screamed of trying slightly too hard. He was flying out on a chartered Embraer Phenom 300, a very respectable light jet, but by the way he was speaking, one might have assumed he owned the entire airport. "I just can't fathom why the catering wasn't loaded prior to my arrival," Brenda Charles was saying, swirling a complimentary sparkling water. "When you pay for a premium charter experience, you expect the sparkling wine to be chilled before you step out of your town car. I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Montgomery," Brenda cooped, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "The catering company was delayed by the weather. I will personally ensure a credit is applied to your account, and I've instructed the ground crew to expedite the loading." Sawyer approached the desk, standing a polite distance behind Charles, waiting for a break in the conversation. He just needed to let the desk know he had arrived so they could radio his flight crew. Brenda's eyes darted past Charles's shoulder and landed on Sawyer. The artificial warmth in her expression vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, hard line of disapproval. She took in his wet track jacket, his scuffed sneakers, and his skin color. In her mind, the calculus was instantaneous and entirely prejudiced. "Excuse me, sir," Brenda said loudly, cutting off whatever Charles was about to say. Her tone was sharp, designed to carry across the quiet lounge. "The service entrance and the driver's lounge are around the back of the building. You cannot be in here." Sawyer blinked momentarily, pulled from his exhaustion. He looked around, assuming she was speaking to someone else. There was no one behind him. "Are you speaking to me?" Sawyer asked, his voice a low, calm baritone. "Yes, I am speaking to you," Brenda said, stepping out from behind the desk. She crossed her arms. "This is a private executive terminal. It is not a waiting area for Uber drivers or food delivery couriers. If you are here to pick up a client, you need to wait in your vehicle in the designated commercial lot. Charles Montgomery turned around, looking Sawyer up and down with a visible sneer. He took a sip of his water and chuckled. Security really needs to do a better job at the perimeter gate, Charles muttered to Brenda. It's becoming an absolute free-for-all lately. Sawyer felt the familiar, heavy knot of frustration tighten in his chest. It was 2026. He was standing in a terminal he used at least twice a month. And yet, because he wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit, he was instantly relegated to the role of the help. "I'm not a driver," Sawyer said, keeping his voice level. He had learned long ago that losing his temper in these situations only gave people like Brenda exactly what they wanted, a reason to paint him as aggressive. "I am a passenger. I'm just here to check in and wait for my flight." Brenda let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A passenger, right, sir? I know every broker and charter client that flies out of this FBO. I have never seen you in my life. Now please, I am asking you nicely to leave before I have to call security. We have actual VIP clients who pay a premium for privacy and security, and your presence is disruptive." Sawyer didn't move. He reached into his pocket to retrieve his ID, a simple gesture to clear up the confusion, but Brenda flinched back dramatically as if he were pulling a weapon. "Don't do that. Keep your hands where I can see them." Sawyer froze, his hands still in his pocket. The sheer absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. He slowly pulled out his hand empty and held it up. "I was reaching for my wallet. To show you my ID." "I don't need to see your ID," Brenda retorted, her face flushing with anger. "I need you to leave." The tension in the opulent terminal was suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife. A few other passengers, wealthy couples reading the Wall Street Journal or sipping champagne, began to peek over their reading glasses. The quiet hum of wealth was interrupted by the ugly, jarring noise of unvarnished bias. Sawyer took a slow, deep breath. "Ma'am," he said, reading her gold name tag. "Brenda, if you would just look at the manifest for the evening, you will see my name, Sawyer Harrison. I am scheduled for a departure to London Heathrow." Brenda marched back behind her desk and aggressively slammed her manicured finger against her computer mouse. "Fine, you want to play this game? Let's look. Sawyer Harrison." She didn't even type the name. She simply scrolled down the short list of evening departures. "I have a NetJets flight to Aspen. I have Mr. Montgomery's Phenom to Chicago. I have a VistaJet Challenger 3500 going to Miami. There is absolutely no charter booked under the name Harrison." "It's not a charter," Sawyer corrected quietly. "It's a private aircraft." Charles scoffed loudly, leaning heavily against the counter. "Oh, this is rich now. He owns the plane." "Listen, buddy," Charles said, stepping towards Sawyer with an unearned air of authority. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull here, or if you're just looking for a dry place to loiter, but you're making people uncomfortable. You need to turn around and walk back out into the rain." "I have absolutely no interest in making anyone uncomfortable," Sawyer replied, his dark eyes locking onto Charles's with a sudden freezing intensity that made the banker take an involuntary half-step backward. "But I have every right to be here. My aircraft is scheduled to arrive at any moment." "That's it," Brenda snapped, picking up a heavy black walkie-talkie from her desk. "Unit 4 to the front desk, code yellow. I have an unauthorized individual refusing to vacate the premises." Sawyer sighed, dropping his bag to the floor. He could have ended it. He could have pulled up his tail number, demanded the manager, or simply called his chief pilot to come inside and sort it out. But a quiet, burning indignation had taken root in his soul. How many times had he swallowed his pride to make other people comfortable? How many times had he flashed his platinum cards or his Wikipedia page to prove his humanity to people who assumed the worst of him? Not tonight. Tonight, he was going to let Brenda dig her own grave straight to the bottom. Less than 60 seconds later, the heavy doors leading from the staff corridor swung open, and a security guard jogged into the lobby. Officer Davies was a large, imposing man with a buzz cut and a hand resting casually on his utility belt. He took one look at the scene, the polished, angry white manager, the wealthy, indignant white passenger, and the tired, casually dressed black man standing in the center of the room, and immediately made his own assumptions. "What's the problem here, Brenda?" Davies asked, positioning himself squarely between Sawyer and the desk. This man wandered in from the street. Brenda lied flawlessly, her voice trembling just enough to play the victim. "He was harassing Mr. Montgomery and demanding access to the tarmac. I asked him to leave and he became combative and refused." Sawyer's jaw tightened. Combative. It was always that word, the ultimate dog whistle designed to justify whatever force came next. "All right, buddy," Officer Davies said, turning to Sawyer with a stern, aggressive posture. "You heard the lady. Party's over. Pick up your bag and let's take a walk." "I haven't harassed anyone," Sawyer stated, his voice ringing out clearly in the silent terminal. "I am waiting for my aircraft. I offered to show her my identification, and she refused to look at it. She is acting entirely on prejudice, and you are acting entirely on her false report." Davy stepped closer, closing the distance until he was inches from Sawyer's face. "I'm not going to tell you again. You are trespassing on private property. You can either walk out those doors or I can call the Port Authority police and have you dragged out in handcuffs. Your choice. Charles let out a quiet, self-satisfied laugh. I'd love to see the cuffs. Personally, Sawyer looked at Charles, then at Davies, and finally at Brenda, who was watching with a smug, triumphant smile. She had won. She had asserted her power, protected her exclusive domain from an intruder, and reinforced her distorted worldview. Okay, Sawyer said softly. He bent down and picked up his leather messenger bag. Smart move, Davies grunted, pointing toward the street-side exit where the rain was still coming down in sheets. But I'm not going out that door, Sawyer continued, turning his back on the security guard. Instead, he faced the massive floor, tosi-siling glass wall that separated the lounge from the tarmac. Beyond the glass, the ramp was soaked, illuminated by the harsh yellow glare of the floodlights. Hey, where do you think you're going? Davies barked, lunging forward to grab Sawyer's shoulder. Before the guard's hand could make contact, a deep, earth-shaking rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the terminal. The high-pitched whine of massive Rolls-Royce jet engines drowned out the ambient jazz playing on the terminal speakers. Brenda gasped, rushing from behind her desk to the window. Charles dropped his sparkling water, the glass shattering on the marble floor. Officer Davies froze in his tracks, breaking through the heavy curtain of rain, moving with the slow, predatory grace of a great white shark. Was a massive aircraft. It was a Gulfstream G650ER, one of the largest, fastest, and most luxurious private jets in the world. Its fuselage was painted in a stunning deep midnight blue, so dark it almost looked black in the night, accented by a single sharp silver stripe running from the nose to the sweeping tail. It was a machine that commanded absolute awe. The Embraer Phenom that Charles was so proud of was currently parked 50 yards away, looking like a child's toy by comparison. The Gulfstream didn't taxi toward the standard parking rows. Instead, guided by two ramp workers in bright yellow rain gear waving illuminated wands, the massive jet turned sharply and headed directly for the VIP red carpet spot, the spot located mere feet from the glass wall of the terminal lounge. The roar of the engines reached a crescendo, rattling the coffee cups in the lounge before spooling down into a low, powerful whine. The aircraft came to a halt on the tail engine, illuminated perfectly by the ramp lights, was the registration number, N77H. Brenda stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly open. Whose plane is that? She stammered. Operations didn't tell me we had a heavy jet arrival tonight. That's a $70 million piece of hardware, Charles whispered, his arrogance entirely evaporating, replaced by the naked greed and awe of a man who worshipped wealth above all else. Sawyer stood completely still, watching his aircraft power down. He casually checked the time on his Rolex Daytona, a platinum model that cost more than Brenda's house, which he had kept hidden under his sleeve until this very moment. He was right on schedule. Outside, the main cabin door of the Gulfstream folded down, transforming into a staircase. The rain was still pouring, but a figure immediately descended the stairs. It was Captain Reynolds, Sawyer's chief pilot. Reynolds was a man in his 50s with silver hair, a crisp white uniform shirt, and 4 gold stripes on his epaulettes. He was holding a massive, heavy-duty black umbrella. Instead of waiting for the ground crew to come to him, Captain Reynolds marched directly across the wet tarmac toward the glass doors of the terminal. Officer Davies, snapping out of his stupor, pointed at Sawyer. I don't care what's happening outside. You are leaving now. I am leaving. You can't go out there, Brenda screamed, her voice cracking in panic. That is an active ramp. It's a federal violation. Sawyer ignored her. He pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping onto the threshold where the warmth of the terminal met the freezing jet fuel-scented rain. Before Davies could grab him, Captain Reynolds reached the door. The pilot didn't look at Brenda. He didn't look at the security guard. He looked only at the man in the faded Yale track jacket. Reynolds smoothly snapped the umbrella open, holding it out to shield Sawyer from the downpour. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," the captain said, his voice loud enough to carry back into the stunned, silent terminal. He offered a respectful nod. "My apologies for the slight delay. Air traffic control held us over Philadelphia due to the weather. The cabin is prepped, the thermostat is at your preferred 71 degrees, and the chef has your dinner ready whenever you'd like to depart for London." Silence fell over the terminal lounge like a lead weight. Brenda looked from the pilot in the crisp uniform to the massive midnight blue jet and finally back to Sawyer. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. The realization of what she had just done hit her with the physical force of a freight train. She hadn't just insulted a wealthy man, she had threatened to call the police on a man who owned a Gulfstream G650ER. In the hierarchy of private aviation, Sawyer Harrison was a god, and she had just treated him like dirt on her shoe. Charles Montgomery, the man who had demanded Sawyer be thrown out into the rain, was staring at the floor, suddenly trying to make himself look as small as physically possible. Officer Davies slowly lowered his hand from his utility belt, stepping backward, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and sudden clarity. Sawyer paused on the threshold. He slowly turned around to face Brenda, the ambient light from the terminal casting his face in sharp relief against the dark, stormy tarmac behind him. "You know, Brenda," Sawyer said, his voice perfectly calm, cutting through the silence of the room. "The irony is I wasn't just coming here to fly out." He reached into his bag and pulled out a sleek black leather folder, tossing it casually onto the mahogany front desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. Harrison Dynamics finalized the acquisition of Apex Aviation Holdings yesterday morning. Sawyer continued, watching Brenda's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated terror. "Guest that includes this specific signature flight support terminal. I came in early today to do a quiet walkthrough to see how my new employees treat the public when they think no one important is watching." Sawyer adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder. "Consider this your exit interview." The black leather folder sat on the mahogany desk like an unexploded bomb. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the VIP lounge was the heavy drumming of rain against the reinforced glass and the low, idling hum of the Gulfstream G650ER's auxiliary power unit outside. Brenda Higgins stared at the folder, her perfectly sprayed blonde hair seemingly the only thing holding her rigid posture together. Her hands, which had been so quick to grab the walkie-talkie and summon security, were now trembling slightly at her sides. Mr. Harrison," Brenda stammered, the artificial honey completely stripped from her voice, leaving behind a dry, reedy croak. I didn't know. Operations didn't brief us on any executive visits. If I had known who you were, that is precisely the problem, Brenda," Sawyer said, his voice dropping to a register so cold it seemed to freeze the air in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. True power never has to shout. Your basic standard of human decency is entirely conditional on a person's net worth or their wardrobe. If I were just a line service technician or a caterer or an Uber driver seeking shelter from a severe storm, would it have been acceptable to treat me with such profound disrespect, to lie to an armed guard and claim I was combative? Officer Davies shifted uncomfortably, his hand dropping completely away from his utility belt. He swallowed hard, looking at the floor. He realized he had been inches away from physically assaulting the new owner of the facility, based on the prejudiced whim of a desk manager. "Sir, Davies started, his voice thick with regret. "I was just responding to a code yellow. I was following protocol." Sawyer turned his dark, intense gaze to the security guard. "Protocol requires you to assess a situation, Officer Davies, not act as a blind enforcer for an escalating employee. You walked in, saw a black man in a hoodie, and made your decision before I even opened my mouth. However, you were acting on false information provided by your manager. You will retain your position, but you will undergo mandatory de-escalation and implicit bias training by the end of the month. If you fail, you will be terminated." "Understood." "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir," Davies replied, relief washing over his face so visibly he looked like he might collapse. He immediately took 2 large steps away from Brenda, visually and physically distancing himself from the sinking ship. Brenda's eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for a lifeline. She looked at Charles Montgomery, the man she had been fawning over just 10 minutes prior. Charles was in the process of attempting a silent, stealthy retreat. He had grabbed his monogrammed garment bag and was trying to inch his way toward the secondary boarding doors, hoping to slip out to his chartered Embraer Phenom and escape the radioactive fallout of his own arrogance. "Mr. Montgomery," Sawyer called out. The name cracked like a whip across the quiet lounge. Charles froze mid-step, his shoulders slumping. He turned around slowly, a sickly, placating smile plastered across his face. "Mr. Harrison, look, this was clearly a massive misunderstanding. Tensions were high. The weather is terrible. I think we all just got off on the wrong foot." "We didn't get off on the wrong foot, Charles," Sawyer corrected calmly. "You took one look at me and told me I was pulling a scam. You told me to go back out into the rain. You told the security guard you wanted to see me in handcuffs. I was stressed about my flight." Charles lied poorly, his confidence entirely shattered. "My firm, Stonecraft Financial, we have a very important merger meeting in Chicago tomorrow morning. I wasn't thinking clearly." Sawyer nodded slowly, pulling a sleek titanium smartphone from his jacket pocket. "Stonecraft Financial. Arthur Pendleton is still your CEO, is he not?" Charles's face lost whatever remaining color it had. "Yes. How do you know Arthur?" Arthur and I sit on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Endowment together, Sawyer said, tapping the screen of his phone. Furthermore, Harrison Dynamics currently handles the back-end data architecture for Stonecraft-Off's entire institutional trading division. It's a contract worth roughly $40 million a year. Charles looked as though he might physically vomit. The Embraer phenom waiting for him outside suddenly felt like a hearse. I am going to board my aircraft now, Sawyer continued, sliding his phone back into his pocket. When I land in London, I have a scheduled call with Arthur to discuss our contract renewal. I think I might mention this encounter. I think Arthur would be very interested to know how his mid-level executives represent the firm's core values in public spaces. Please, Charles whispered, the word escaping him before he could stop it. Please, Mr. Harrison. It took me 15 years to make vice president. Then, you should have spent at least one of those years learning how to speak to people, Sawyer replied, his tone devoid of sympathy. He turned his back on the banker, dismissing him entirely. Sawyer looked at Brenda one last time. She was staring at the black folder, tears of pure, unadulterated panic welling in her eyes. Open the folder, Brenda, Sawyer instructed softly. With shaking hands, she flipped the heavy leather cover open. Inside was a single crisp sheet of paper, bearing the Harrison Dynamics corporate letterhead. It was an internal memo effective immediately, detailing the complete restructuring of the FBO's management team. At the very bottom, highlighted in sharp red ink, was a directive to terminate the employment of Brenda Higgins. With cause immediately upon the completion of the acquisition walkthrough, your badge and your terminal keys go on the desk, Sawyer said, stepping backward toward the tarmac doors where Captain Reynolds was patiently waiting under the umbrella. Security will escort you to your vehicle. You are no longer authorized to be on this property. The transition from the toxic, glaring atmosphere of the terminal into the sanctuary of the Gulfstream G650ER was jarring in its perfection. Sawyer stepped up the air stairs, ducking his head slightly to enter the main cabin. The air inside smelled faintly of custom Laro Piana leather, fresh orchids, and the rich, dark aroma of Sumatran coffee. The cabin was a masterpiece of bespoke aviation design. Warm Macassar ebony wood paneling, cream-cold captain's chairs, and deep pile carpeting that absorbed all sound. It was an environment engineered to eliminate stress, a flying fortress of absolute privacy. Sarah, his lead flight attendant, was waiting in the forward galley with a warm, genuine smile. She held a steaming hot, damp towel on a silver tray. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Harrison," Sarah said smoothly. "I saw the commotion through the windows. Is everything all right?" "Everything is handled, Sarah," Sawyer sighed, taking the hot towel and pressing it against his tired face, finally allowing the exhaustion of the past 3 days to wash over him. "It's just been a very long week." "Well, the door is secured, and ATC has given us a direct routing to altitude to get us above this weather system," she informed him. "Chef prepared the miso-glazed Ceylon sea bass you requested. Would you like it after takeoff, or would you prefer to rest first?" "Dinner after takeoff would be perfect. Thank you, Sarah." Sawyer walked back to his dedicated workspace in the mid-sea cabin. He slid his messenger bag onto the plush leather sofa and took his seat at the polished mahogany conference table. The heavy thud of the main cabin door closing sealed him off entirely from the world outside. Through the oval window, he watched as Brenda Higgins, shadowed closely by Officer Davies, walked out the front doors of the terminal and out into the torrential rain carrying a small cardboard box of her personal belongings. A moment later, the twin Rolls-Royce BR-725 engines roared to life, a deep resonant vibration that sent a thrill of raw power through the airframe. The massive jet began to taxi away from the terminal, leaving Charles Montgomery's tiny phenom and a ruined career in its wake. As the jet lined up on the runway and surged forward, pinning Sawyer back in his seat with relentless thrust, he opened his laptop. The aircraft broke through the heavy cloud layer at 10,000 feet, bursting into a breathtaking, perfectly clear night sky filled with cold, brilliant stars. The Wi-Fi connected instantly. Sawyer didn't rest. Karma wasn't just about the immediate confrontation. It was about ensuring the root of the problem was pulled out entirely. He pulled up his secure video conferencing software and initiated a call to Richard Sterling, the Vice President of Operations for the newly acquired Aviation Division. Richard answered on the second ring, sitting in his home office in Connecticut. "Sawyer," Richard said, adjusting his glasses. "I saw the tail telemetry. You're airborne. How was the walkthrough at Teterboro?" "Enlightening," Sawyer said dryly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I just terminated the front desk manager, Brenda Higgins, with cause." Richard blinked, surprised. "With cause, Sawyer? We haven't even officially announced the transition to the ground staff yet. What happened?" Sawyer recounted the entire interaction completely devoid of emotion, laying out the facts like a prosecutor presenting evidence. He detailed the immediate assumption of his status, the refusal to check his identification, the lying to security, and the weaponization of police force against him, simply because of his race and attire. As Sawyer spoke, Richard's face tightened into a scowl of professional horror. In the highly regulated, ultra-competitive world of private aviation, discretion and elite customer service were the only things that separated one company from another. "I am completely appalled, Sawyer," Richard said, rubbing his temples. "That is a catastrophic failure of standard operating procedure, let alone basic human decency. We are incredibly fortunate it was you, and not a legacy charter client, or we would be facing a massive discrimination lawsuit." "I don't want just apologies, Richard. I want systemic change," Sawyer instructed, his voice firm and unwavering. "By Monday morning, I want a complete audit of the hiring and training protocols for all customer-facing staff across our entire FBO network. We are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for profiling of any kind. I want an outside consulting firm brought in to rewrite the implicit bias training, and I want it mandatory for everyone from the line service techs to the regional directors. Consider it done," Richard said, firmly, taking furious notes on a legal pad. "I will personally oversee the Tedborough terminal's restructuring tomorrow." "Good." Sawyer closed the window. He had one more piece of business to handle before he could sleep. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Arthur Pendleton. It was late, but CEOs of major financial institutions rarely slept when there was money to be moved. The phone rang 3 times before Arthur's booming, aristocratic voice filled the earpiece. "Sawyer, my man," Arthur boomed. "I thought you were wheels up to London tonight. Don't tell me you're calling to renegotiate the data contract already." "I am wheels up, Arthur. I'm calling from the air," Sawyer said, taking a sip of the sparkling water Sarah had just placed on his desk. "And the contract is fine, but I did run into one of your people on the tarmac tonight. Charles Montgomery." There was a slight pause on the line. "He's heading up to Chicago for the mid-market merger. Did he introduce himself?" "He did," Sawyer said, his voice dangerously soft. "He introduced himself by sneering at me, telling me I looked like a scam artist, and demanding airport security dragged me out of the terminal in handcuffs because my attire offended him." Dead silence hung on the line. The temperature of the conversation dropped to absolute zero. Are you serious?" Arthur finally asked, his voice losing all of its jovial warmth. "I am perfectly serious," Sawyer replied. You and I do a lot of business together. We sit on the same boards. We talk about corporate responsibility and leadership. If this is the kind of culture Stonecraft Financial is fostering in its mid-level executives, men who casually weaponize their privilege to humiliate minorities in public spaces, then I need to seriously reconsider if Harrison Dynamics should be associating its proprietary architecture with your verm Sawyer. "Please, let me stop you right there," Arthur said quickly, the panic evident in his voice. A $40 million tech infrastructure contract was not something you lost over an arrogant VP. That behavior is entirely unacceptable and does not represent this firm. I am profoundly embarrassed that you had to experience that from someone carrying my company's business card. I don't need you to be embarrassed, Arthur. I need to know how you handle liabilities. "I handle them decisively," Arthur said, his tone turning ruthlessly corporate. "Montgomery's plane hasn't landed in Chicago yet. When he touches down, he will find a message from HR waiting for him on his phone. He will not be attending that merger meeting tomorrow. He will be on a commercial flight back to New York, where he will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation, which, given what you've just told me, will likely be very short. I appreciate your swift action, Arthur. Have a good night." Sawyer hung up the phone and set it face down on the polished wood table. The storm was behind them now. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of stars, the quiet hum of the engines carrying him away from the ugliness of the tarmac at Teterboro. He had lost his patience, but he had cleaned house. Karma had been delivered precisely and without mercy. 2 hours and 45 minutes later, the chartered Embraer Phenom 300 touched down hard on the rain-slicked runway at Chicago Midway International Airport. Charles Montgomery gripped the leather armrests, his knuckles white. The flight had been turbulent, both meteorologically and mentally. Every time the light jet had dropped in a pocket of rough air over Ohio, Charles's mind had flashed back to the piercing, unbothered gaze of Sawyer Harrison. "He's just a tech guy," Charles had told himself repeatedly, sipping a lukewarm scotch the solitary flight attendant had poured him. Arthur wouldn't torch a 15-year career over one misunderstanding in a terminal. "I bring in too much revenue." As the Phenom taxied toward the Atlantic Aviation private terminal, Charles finally felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. He had kept it in airplane mode, wanting to delay the inevitable, but the moment the pilot announced their arrival, the device connected to the local cell towers. It didn't just vibrate, it convulsed. Charles pulled the device out and stared at the lock screen. There were 14 missed calls from his direct managing director, 6 from Arthur Pendleton's executive assistant, and a string of automated text messages from Stonecraft of Financial's IT department. He tapped the screen, his thumb suddenly feeling thick and clumsy. He tried to open his secure Microsoft Outlook app to check his corporate email. A gray box popped up. Access denied. Your administrative privileges have been revoked. Please contact your system administrator. A cold, heavy stone of dread dropped into Charles's stomach. He tried his Slack app. Locked out. He tried the firm's internal financial terminal app. Deactivated. He was digitally severed from the company he had dedicated a decade and a half of his life to. "Mr. Montgomery," the flight attendant asked, opening the cabin door and letting in the freezing Chicago wind. "Your black car is waiting on the ramp." "Right, yes, thank you," Charles mumbled, grabbing his monogrammed garment bag. His legs felt like lead as he descended the narrow air stairs. A sleek Cadillac Escalade was idling on the tarmac, the driver holding a placard with Montgomery Stonecraft off printed on it. Charles climbed into the back, desperate for the warmth of the SUV. "Good evening, sir," the driver said, putting the car in gear. "Yes," Charles said, staring blankly at his dead phone. Before the driver reached the airport exit gate, his own dashboard console chimed. The driver frowned, tapping the screen, then glanced back at Charles through the rearview mirror. "Excuse me, Mr. Montgomery. Dispatch just sent an alert. The corporate account linked to this reservation, the Stonecraft off Financial American Express, has just been declined. It says the card has been canceled." Charles stopped breathing. That has to be a mistake. "Run it again." "They did, sir, twice. I'm afraid I need an alternative form of payment to leave the airport property, or I have to ask you to exit the vehicle." The reality of Sawyer Harrison's power crashed down on Charles with the force of an avalanche. Sawyer hadn't just complained to Arthur Pendleton, he had forced Arthur to perform a corporate execution. Charles was stranded in Chicago at 1,000 in the morning. He had no hotel reservation, no corporate card, and as of roughly 2 hours ago, no job. The multi-million-dollar merger he was supposed to lead at 900 a.m. would happen without him, handed off to a subordinate who knew how to treat human beings with respect. Charles pulled out his personal battered Visa card and handed it to the driver, his hands shaking violently. "Take me to a Marriott near O'Hare," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I need to book a commercial flight back to New York in the morning." He looked out the tinted window of the Escalade as they drove away from the private terminal, watching a massive Gulfstream jet, similar to Sawyer's, taxiing in the distance. The world of bespoke luxury, exclusive terminals, and unchallenged privilege that Charles had so desperately clung to was gone, completely shattered by a single catastrophic error in judgment. The transition from the violent storm-battered skies of the American East Coast to the serene pastel-painted dawn over the English Channel was profound. At 43,000 feet, the Gulfstream G650ER sliced through the thin sub-zero atmosphere with the effortless grace of a silver bullet. Inside the cabin, the environment was a masterclass in engineered tranquility. The ambient lighting had subtly shifted over the last 6 hours, transitioning from the warm amber of evening to a soft simulated sunrise, designed to align the circadian rhythms of the aircraft's billionaire owner. Sawyer Harrison sat in the aft stateroom, the faint, comforting hum of the twin Rolls-Royce BR 725 engines serving as a white noise backdrop to his morning routine. The faded Yale track jacket and the scuffed New Balance sneakers, the attire that had sparked such a vicious display of prejudice at Teterboro, were neatly folded and stowed away in his leather duffel. In their place, Sawyer wore his armor, a bespoke charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, a crisp white poplin shirt, and a deep navy silk tie. He adjusted the platinum Rolex Daytona on his wrist, the heavy metal cold against his skin. It was a stark visual transformation, but internally Sawyer felt no different. He was the exact same man who had stood quietly in the rain just hours prior. The only difference was the perception of the world around him. Sarah, his lead flight attendant, tapped lightly on the sliding mahogany door before entering. She carried a silver tray bearing a single cup of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee and a folded, freshly printed copy of the Financial Times. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Sarah said, her tone professional, yet carrying the genuine warmth that Sawyer valued in his crew. "We are approximately 40 minutes from our descent into London Heathrow. Air traffic control has already cleared us for a direct approach. The weather is a brisk 48 degrees and overcast, but dry." "Thank you, Sarah. The coffee smells exceptional," Sawyer replied, accepting the cup. Did the crew manage to get some adequate rest? We did, sir. The transition was smooth. She offered a polite nod and stepped back out, sliding the door shut to afford him his privacy. Sawyer took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the rich, complex flavor ground him. He reached across the polished Macassar ebony table and opened his encrypted titanium laptop. The biometric scanner flashed green and his secure corporate dashboard materialized on the screen. He bypassed the standard market updates and directly opened an urgent flagged briefing from Richard Sterling, the vice president of operations for his newly acquired aviation division. The subject line read, Post-Incident Containment and Teterboro Restructuring Confidential. Sawyer opened the document. Richard had been ruthlessly efficient, a trait Sawyer paid him very well to maintain. The report detailed the immediate aftermath of the previous night's confrontation, and the corporate guillotine had fallen with uncompromising precision. Brenda Higgins had not gone quietly. According to Richard's meticulously documented timeline, after being escorted from the signature flight support terminal by Officer Davies, Brenda had sat in her car in the employee parking lot and attempted to wage a desperate, scorched earth campaign to save her livelihood. Operating under the delusion that her 15 years in the industry afforded her a shield of immunity, she had immediately dialed the regional director of a competing FBO network, a man who had served as her mentor early in her career. Brenda had tried to spin the narrative. She claimed that a belligerent, unkempt individual had breached the secure terminal, and when she followed standard security protocols, she was wrongfully terminated by a new out-of-poach owner who didn't understand the exclusive culture of private aviation. It was a lie built on the assumption that her word would inherently carry more weight than Sawyer's. It was a fatal miscalculation. Richard's report detailed the twist of hard karma that followed. Corporate entities do not operate on loyalty. They operate on liability and profit. Before Brenda had even placed that phone call, Richard had already dispatched an emergency memo to the board of directors of every major FBO network in North America. Attached to the memo was the raw, unedited security footage from the Teterboro terminal, complete with crystal clear audio. The footage showed Sawyer, calm and compliant, offering his identification. It showed Brenda's immediate, aggressive escalation. It captured her explicitly lying to an armed security guard, attempting to weaponize law enforcement against a peaceful passenger solely based on his race and attire. More importantly, Richard's memo clearly stated that Harrison Dynamics, which controlled a staggering logistical budget and a fleet of 20 corporate aircraft, would permanently sever all contracts and fueling agreements with any FBO network that employed individuals demonstrating such blatant discriminatory behavior. Sawyer was a whale, a client that brought in millions of dollars in landing fees and fuel purchases annually. No general manager in the country was going to risk losing the Harrison Dynamics contract over a mid-level desk manager. When Brenda's mentor answered her frantic call, he didn't offer sympathy. He read her Richard's memo verbatim, informed her she was a walking, talking discrimination lawsuit, and told her to lose his number. By sunrise on the East Coast, Brenda Higgins was not just unemployed, she was functionally blacklisted from the entire luxury aviation sector. She had lost her unvested stock options. Her severance had been legally denied due to termination with extreme cause, and the exclusive gatekeeping world she had so viciously protected had permanently locked its gates on her. Sawyer read the paragraphs with a cold, analytical detachment. He took no joy in destroying a person's livelihood, but he understood the necessity of excision. A tumor cannot be reasoned with. It must be removed to save the body. He scrolled down to the second half of the briefing. This section pertained to Charles Montgomery and the Stonecraft financial account. The reality of corporate survival is often far more brutal than any personal vendetta. Arthur Pendleton, the CEO of Stonecraft, had recognized the existential threat Sawyer's ultimatum posed. A $40 million tech infrastructure contract was the lifeblood of Stonecraft's trading floor. To save the contract, Arthur didn't just fire Charles Montgomery. He made an absolute spectacle of him. Sawyer clicked on a linked press release that Stonecraft Financial had published to the wire at 6:00 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The headline was, "A Masterpiece of Corporate Spin. Stonecraft Financial announces leadership restructuring in mid-market division, reaffirming commitment to inclusive excellence." Arthur had used Charles's termination as an opportunity to boost the firm's ESG, environmental, social, and governance rating. The press release proudly announced that the Chicago merger meeting was now being spearheaded by Charles's former subordinate, a highly qualified woman of color whom Charles had reportedly passed over for promotion twice. Sawyer closed the press release, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. At that exact moment, 3,000 meters away, Charles Montgomery was sitting in Terminal B of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. He was slumped in a hard plastic chair near a crowded boarding gate, staring blankly at the same press release on his smartphone screen. His corporate American Express was dead, his company laptop was bricked because he had been terminated for a severe violation of the company's code of conduct, his lucrative golden parachute and annual bonus were completely voided. Charles had been forced to use his personal credit card to book a last-minute middle-seat ticket on a commercial Delta flight back to LaGuardia. He was surrounded by exhausted families, crying infants, and college students, the exact demographic of everyday people he had spent his entire career looking down upon. He had built his entire identity around the illusion of superiority, and Sawyer Harrison had shattered it with a single phone call. The $70 million Gulfstream Charles had coveted so deeply was currently flying over the Atlantic, while Charles was waiting to see if his carry-on bag would be gate check. A gentle chime resonated through the cabin of the G650ER, pulling Sawyer from his thoughts. The seatbelt sign illuminated. "Mr. Harrison, we are beginning our final descent into London Heathrow." Captain Reynolds' voice echoed smoothly over the intercom. "We have been cleared for a direct routing to the Windsor suite." Sawyer closed his laptop and slid it into his leather bag. He looked out the oval window as the aircraft pierced the thick gray cloud layer, revealing the sprawling historic expanse of London below. The River Thames snaked through the city like a ribbon of dark steel. The Gulfstream did not taxi toward the chaotic, towering structures of Terminal 5, where tens of thousands of passengers were beginning their frantic daily transit. Instead, guided by a follow-me vehicle flashing amber lights, the massive jet veered off toward a secluded, heavily guarded compound on the southern edge of the airfield, the Heathrow VIP Windsor Suite. This was a facility entirely separate from the public airport. It was a standalone terminal reserved exclusively for royalty, heads of state, and a highly vetted list of ultra-high-end net worth individuals. There were no public concourses, no security lines, and no front desk managers acting as self-appointed gatekeepers. The jet glided to a halt, perfectly aligned with a pristine red carpet that had been rolled out onto the tarmac. The auxiliary power unit spooled down, and the main cabin door folded open. Sawyer picked up his bag and walked to the exit. Captain Reynolds was already standing at the top of the air stairs, his uniform impeccably pressed, holding his captain's hat under his arm. "An absolute pleasure, Mr. Harrison," Reynolds said, offering a crisp, respectful nod. "We will have the aircraft serviced, catered, and fueled for your return flight to New York on Thursday. Good luck with your board meetings." "Thank you, Captain. Ensure you and the crew enjoy your layover." "Put any expenses at the Rosewood Hotel on the corporate account," Sawyer replied, shaking the pilot's hand. Sawyer descended the stairs into the cool London air. Waiting for him at the base of the steps was a custom-armored black Range Rover Sentinel. Two attendants in tailored dark suits and white gloves stood perfectly at attention. A third official, an agent from UK Border Force, stood quietly with an encrypted tablet. "Welcome to London, Mr. Harrison," the Border Force agent said politely. There was no hesitation, no underlying suspicion, no demand to prove he belonged. The agent simply scanned Sawyer's biometric passport chip, matched it to the VIP manifest, and stepped aside. "You are cleared for entry. Have a wonderful stay in the United Kingdom." "Thank you," Sawyer said, returning the man's polite nod. One of the white-gloved attendants smoothly opened the heavy rear door of the Range Rover. Sawyer slid into the plush leather interior, setting his messenger bag on the seat beside him. The door closed with a solid vault-like thud, instantly silencing the ambient noise of the airfield. As the luxury SUV pulled away from the Gulfstream and glided smoothly past the heavily armed police checkpoint at the exit of the Windsor Suite, Sawyer looked back at his magnificent aircraft. It sat on the tarmac, a triumph of engineering and a testament to his life's work. The events of the past 12 hours replayed briefly in his mind. The rain at Teterboro, the sneer on Charles Montgomery's face, the vicious entitlement in Brenda Higgins's voice. They had mistaken his quiet demeanor for weakness, and his skin color for a lack of status. They had learned in the most devastating way possible that true power does not need to perform. It does not need to boast, and it does not need to wear a uniform to demand respect. True power is the quiet, immovable architecture of reality. When you attempt to push against it, you do not move the power, you simply break yourself against it. Sawyer Harrison pulled his phone from his suit pocket and dialed his London managing director. The storm was over. It was time to get back to work. True power rarely announces itself with a shout. It usually arrives in a whisper, dressed in faded denim, waiting patiently for the truth to reveal itself. The incident at Teterboro Airport was not merely a clash of egos, but a profound collision between outdated, toxic prejudice and the uncompromising reality of modern success. Sawyer Harrison did not need to raise his voice or cause a scene to dismantle the fragile, arrogant worlds of Brenda Higgins and Charles Montgomery. He simply allowed their own biases to be their undoing. Karma in the real world is rarely an abstract concept. It is the swift, undeniable consequence of treating others as lesser than. Ultimately, Sawyer proved that dignity cannot be determined by a dress code, and true authority is not wielded by holding others back, but by possessing the undeniable leverage to move the world forward. One private jet and one corporate restructuring at a